London. June 1772. A merchant banker named Alexander Fordyce walks into a coffee house on Threadneedle Street. He orders nothing. He sits. He stares at the table. 3 hours earlier, his bank collapsed. By noon, 5 more banks will follow. By the end of the week, 20 banks across Britain and the continent will shut their doors. Credit will freeze. Panic will spread. And the question everyone will be whispering in those coffee houses won't be, what happened? It will be, how deep does this go? Because at the center of the crisis, like a black hole warping everything around it, sits something that shouldn't be there at all. Not a kingdom, not a government, a corporation. A corporation that rules 20 million people, that collects taxes from Indian peasants, that fights wars with its own army, that promises 12.5% dividends to London shareholders. And that corporation is broke. Before we understand how the East India Company nearly destroyed the British financial system, we need to understand what it actually was. Because most people hear East India Company and think shipping. Tea, spices, trade. That's not wrong, but it's not complete. The company didn't just trade with India, it ruled India, or at least large parts of it. Let that sink in. A publicly traded corporation, with shareholders, a stock price, and quarterly expectations, governed territory larger than France. It collected land taxes. It maintained an army of over 200,000 men. It negotiated treaties. It declared wars. If that sounds insane to modern ears, you're right. It was insane then too, but it worked. Until it didn't. The company was founded in 1600 as a modest venture to compete with Dutch and Portuguese traders in the spice business. For its first 150 years, it operated like any merchant company. Buy goods cheap in Asia, sell them expensive in Europe, pocket the difference. But something changed in the 1750s. War changed it. The Mughal Empire, which had ruled India for centuries, began fragmenting. Local rulers fought each other. European powers, Britain, France, Portugal, saw opportunity. And the East India Company, which had always maintained a small private army to protect its warehouses, suddenly found itself fighting battles. Not just skirmishes, full-scale wars. In 1757, at the Battle of Plassey, company forces defeated the Nawab of Bengal. And in the aftermath, something extraordinary happened. The company didn't just win a battle, it won a revenue stream. Bengal was one of the richest regions on earth. Its textile industry, its rice production, its population, this was wealth on a scale that dwarfed anything the company had seen before. And after Plassey, the Mughal emperor granted the company the Diwani, the right to collect land revenue from Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Think about what that means. A corporation answerable to shareholders in London, obsessed with quarterly profits, run by merchants and accountants, was now the tax authority for 20 million people. This wasn't commerce anymore. This was empire. Except it was an empire with a stock price. And that's where the madness begins. Here's the model the company sold to investors. Bengal's land revenue would pour into company coffers. Those revenues would pay for the company's expenses, soldiers, administrators, fortifications. And whatever was left over would be shipped back to London as profit. Dividends would soar, stock prices would climb. Simple, elegant, profitable. There was just one problem. The numbers were lies. Not intentional lies, maybe. Optimistic projections, rosy estimates, the kind of financial storytelling every company tells itself when it's desperate to believe its own success. The company estimated Bengal's annual land revenue at around £3 million. In reality, they collected closer to £1.5 million. And of that, much was eaten up by corruption, inefficiency, and the cost of actually running a pseudo-government. Meanwhile, expenses were exploding. Wars don't pay for themselves, no matter what, company directors told shareholders. The company fought campaigns against Indian rulers, against the French, against anyone who threatened its monopoly. Each war cost money. Soldiers demanded pay, cannons required foundries, supply lines stretched across oceans. But here's where it gets truly dangerous. The company kept paying dividends anyway. In 1766, the company declared a dividend of 12.5%. Shareholders were thrilled. The stock price hit 273. Investors borrowed money to buy more shares, expecting the good times to roll forever. One small problem, the company didn't actually have that much profit. It paid dividends by borrowing, it borrowed from London banks, it borrowed against future revenue, it issued bonds. It took short-term loans and hoped Bengal's taxes would arrive in time to cover them. Does this sound familiar? It should. This is the 18th century version of a company burning cash while reporting growth. This is We Work in Wigs. This is Enron with muskets. And the entire British financial system was exposed to it. Why? Because the East India Company wasn't just a company, it was the company. Its stock was one of the most widely held securities in Britain. Merchant banks lent to it. Investors speculated on it. Pension funds, yes, they existed, held it. When you hear too big to fail, this is where that story starts. By 1772, the company owed over £1.3 million to the Bank of England alone. It had more debt scattered across dozens of private banks. It had bonds coming due. It had dividend promises it couldn't keep. And the revenue from Bengal? Still disappointing, still late, still eaten up by costs. But the directors kept smiling. The stock price held. And nobody asked the dangerous question, what happens if the money stops? June 1772. The question gets answered. It starts with speculation. Not in India. In London, Alexander Fordyce, the banker we met at the beginning, had been betting heavily against East India Company stock. He believed the price was inflated. He shorted it, borrowed shares, sold them, planning to buy them back cheaper when reality hit. Except the stock kept rising, and Fordyce kept losing. On June 10th, his bank collapsed. £300,000 in losses. Gone. In isolation, one bank failure shouldn't matter. But credit markets don't work in isolation. They work on confidence. And when one bank falls, everyone starts asking, who else is exposed? The answer, everyone. Within days, panic spread. Banks that had lent to Fordyce suddenly needed cash, so they called in loans from other banks. Those banks needed cash, so they stopped making new loans. Credit froze. And right in the middle of that freeze sat the East India Company, needing to roll over massive debts. The company went to the Bank of England. We need a loan. The bank replied, on what collateral? Future tax revenue from Bengal. And when does that arrive? 6 months, maybe 8, depends on the monsoon. The bank said no. The company went to private banks. Same answer. Suddenly the empire had a liquidity crisis. Think about the absurdity. An entity ruling 20 million people, collecting taxes from one of the richest regions on earth, couldn't find £1 million in ready cash. Because the money wasn't there. It was stuck in India, stuck in trade goods, stuck in warehouses, stuck in slow-moving ships crossing the Indian Ocean. Empire had become a balance sheet, and the balance sheet didn't balance. By August, the company's stock price had collapsed from 280 to 130. Shareholders panicked. Margin calls triggered more selling. Banks holding company bonds saw their assets evaporate. The 1772 crisis wasn't just about the company. It was about credit contagion. One domino hit another, until the entire British financial system teetered. Merchant houses in Amsterdam failed. Scottish banks collapsed. Insurance funds blew up. This is the part where governments have a choice. Let it burn or intervene. Parliament didn't want to intervene. Why should taxpayers rescue a private corporation that mismanaged its finances? But Parliament couldn't afford not to. Because by this point, the company wasn't just a corporation. It was a systemic risk. Its debts were woven into every major financial institution. Its stock was held by widows, pensioners, aristocrats, and banks. If it collapsed completely, it would take half of Britain's financial system with it. So Parliament did what governments always do when faced with too big to fail. They bailed it out. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, which gave the company a monopoly on tea sales in the American colonies. The goal? Generate revenue to keep the company afloat. How'd that work out? It triggered the Boston Tea Party, which triggered the American Revolution, which cost Britain far more than the company was ever worth. But that's a different story. The larger point is this. The state stepped in. Parliament didn't call it a bailout. They called it regulatory oversight and emergency relief. But everyone knew what it was. The company survived, barely. But it never recovered its independence. Over the next decades, Parliament imposed more controls, more audits, more interference. By 1858, after another crisis, the Indian Rebellion, the British government formally dissolved the company and took direct control of India. The corporation that became an empire was finally consumed by the empire it created. And the lesson? Once a private entity becomes too big to fail, it's no longer private. The state owns it. The taxpayers own it, even if the shareholders don't realize it yet. So what do we learn from this? Empires don't collapse from losing battles. They collapse when the balance sheet breaks. The East India Company survived for 150 years because its financial model worked. Trade was profitable. Monopolies printed money. But the moment it tried to be both corporation and government, the math stopped working. You can't pay dividends and fight wars. You can't promise quarterly growth and govern 20 million people. You can't maintain a stock price and collect taxes in a country 6,000 miles away where the money takes 8 months to arrive. Something has to give, and when it gives, the question becomes, who pays? In 1772, British taxpayers paid. In 2008, American taxpayers paid. The names change, the currency changes, the mechanism stays the same. Here's the darker truth. The East India Company crisis wasn't a failure of capitalism or imperialism alone. It was a failure of accountability. The company privatized profits and socialized losses. Shareholders got rich when things went well. Taxpayers absorbed the damage when things went wrong. The directors who made the bad decisions? Most retired wealthy. The peasants in Bengal, who actually paid the taxes that were supposed to fund this empire, they were never asked. They were simply exploited, then abandoned when the system collapsed. That's the real cost of too big to fail. Not the bailout money, the moral hazard. Because once you establish that a corporation can act like a government, extract wealth like a government, and then demand a rescue when it fails, you've created a monster. And that monster doesn't die. It just changes names. Today, we don't call them East India Companies. We call them systemically important financial institutions. But the logic is identical. Expand until you're indispensable. Take risks because someone else will absorb the downside. And when the crisis comes, demand the state intervene. The only difference? In 1772, people were at least honest about it. They called it empire. Today, we call it markets. But the balance sheet always comes due. Always. If this story showed you something they don't teach in school, hit subscribe. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it'll crush you all the same.